Layla, a talented 10-year-old ballerina, never imagined that her passion for dance would lead her into the harsh reality of prejudice. One evening, she was given a last-minute chance to perform at an elite event, unaware of the storm brewing behind the curtains. As she stepped onto the stage at the prestigious Rutherford family's party, Layla found herself the target of their racist fury. Despite her flawless performance, the family's anger boiled over, threatening to overshadow her moment of brilliance. But what Layla's strength and grace revealed that night would change everything and leave even the harshest critics speechless. What shocking truth was revealed in the face of the Rutherford's rage? And how did Layla's talent and resilience shine through the darkest of moments? Stay tuned to find out. Before we get started, let us know where you're watching from. And if Layla's story touches your heart, don't forget to subscribe. The gentle sound of classical music filled the air as 10-year-old Layla twirled gracefully across the worn wooden floor of the dance studio. Her dark skin glistened with a thin sheen of sweat, evidence of the hours she had already spent practicing that morning. Despite her young age, Layla moved with the poise and control of a seasoned ballerina, each movement precise and fluid. Ms. Caroline, Layla's mentor and favorite teacher at the prestigious Willowbrook Ballet Academy, watched from the corner of the room, her eyes sparkling with pride. "Beautiful Layla," she called out as the young dancer completed a particularly challenging sequence. "Your fouettes are getting stronger every day." Layla beamed at the praise, her chest swelling with a mixture of pride and determination. She had been working tirelessly on perfecting that move for weeks. "Thank you, Miss Caroline," she said, slightly out of breath. "I've been practicing extra at home." "It shows," Miss Caroline replied with a warm smile. "You have a gift, Layla. I've never seen someone your age with such natural talent and dedication." Layla's smile widened, but there was a flicker of something else in her eyes, a hint of the weight she carried on her small shoulders. "Do you really think I could make it to the big stages one day, Miss Caroline? Like the New York City Ballet?" Miss Caroline crossed the room and placed a gentle hand on Layla's shoulder. "With your talent and work ethic? Absolutely. But it won't be easy. You'll face challenges that have nothing to do with your abilities." Layla nodded solemnly, understanding the unspoken truth behind her teacher's words. As a young black girl in the predominantly white world of ballet, she knew she would have to work twice as hard to prove herself. "I'm ready," Layla said, her voice filled with quiet determination. "I won't let anything stop me from following my dreams." Miss Caroline squeezed her shoulder. "That's my girl. Now, let's work on your arabesque before your mother arrives." As they continued practicing, Layla's mind wandered to her mother, Maria. She pictured her mom rushing from her job as a hospital orderly to her evening shift at the local diner, all to keep Layla's ballet dreams alive. The thought made Layla's chest tighten with a mixture of love and guilt. Later that evening, Layla sat at their small kitchen table, homework spread out before her as Maria bustled around preparing a simple dinner of rice and beans. The apartment was modest, with secondhand furniture and bare walls, but it was filled with love and the sweet aroma of home-cooked meals. "How was practice today, Mija?" Maria asked, stirring the pot on the stove. Layla's face lit up. "It was great, Mama. Miss Caroline said my fouettes are getting stronger, and she thinks I could make it to the big stages one day." Maria turned from the stove, her tired eyes crinkling with pride. "Of course you can, mi amor. You can do anything you set your mind to." Layla's smile faltered slightly. "But Mama, all that traveling and those fancy costumes, it's so expensive." "I heard Rebecca talking about how much her parents spend on her ballet stuff." Maria set down her spoon and crossed the small kitchen, kneeling beside Layla's chair. She took her daughter's hands in her own, her calloused palms a testament to her hard work. "Listen to me, Layla. We may not have much, but we have each other, and we have your talent. That's worth more than all the money in the world. Don't you ever let anyone make you feel less than because of what we don't have. You hear me?" Layla nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I hear you, Mama." Maria kissed Layla's forehead. "Good. Now finish your homework while I get dinner ready. We'll practice your arabesques after we eat." As Layla turned back to her schoolwork, her mind drifted to Rebecca, the star dancer of Willowbrook Ballet Academy. Rebecca, with her long blonde hair and expensive leotards, who always seemed to get the lead roles in performances. Layla pushed down the twinge of jealousy that threatened to surface. She knew she was just as talented as Rebecca, maybe even more so. She just needed a chance to prove it. Across town, in a sprawling mansion on the outskirts of Willowbrook, another dinner was being prepared. But unlike the humble meal in Layla's apartment, this was a lavish affair with a team of professional chefs and an army of servers bustling about. Elizabeth Rutherford stood in the center of her enormous kitchen, barking orders at the staff as they prepared for her daughter Emily's upcoming birthday extravaganza. Her perfectly coiffed blonde hair didn't move an inch as she gestured emphatically, her diamond rings catching the light. No, she snapped at a flustered-looking chef. I specifically said the hors d'oeuvres should be arranged in the shape of a swan. A swan? Is that so difficult to understand? The chef mumbled an apology and scurried away to fix the offending platter. Elizabeth pinched the bridge of her nose, exhaling dramatically. Honestly, it's so hard to find good help these days. Her husband, Charles Rutherford, barely looked up from his newspaper as he sat at the kitchen island. Now, dear, he said in a placating tone, I'm sure everything will be perfect for Emily's party. It always is. Elizabeth's eyes narrowed. It had better be. The Carmichaels and the Prestons will be there, not to mention half the country club. This party needs to be the talk of the town for months. As if on cue, their daughter Emily bounced into the kitchen, her blonde curls bobbing. Mommy, is Rebecca really going to dance at my party? Like a real ballerina? Elizabeth's face softened slightly as she turned to her daughter. Of course, darling. We've arranged for the star dancer from Willowbrook Academy to perform just for you and your friends. It's going to be magical. Emily clapped her hands in excitement. I can't wait. I want to be just like Rebecca when I grow up. Charles lowered his newspaper, a frown creasing his forehead. Now, Emily, you know ballet is just a hobby. When you grow up, you'll take over the family business, just like your mother and I have always planned. Emily's face fell slightly, but she knew better than to argue. Yes, Daddy, she said quietly. Elizabeth shooed her daughter out of the kitchen. Go on now, Emily. Mommy has a lot of work to do to make sure your party is perfect. As Emily left, Elizabeth turned back to her husband. Speaking of the guest list, Charles, I do hope you remembered to be selective in your invitations this year. Charles raised an eyebrow. Of course, dear. You know I always am. Only the right sort of people for our Emily's party. Elizabeth nodded approvingly. Good. We can't have a repeat of last year's incident with the Johnsons. Honestly, letting their daughter bring that friend of hers. It was embarrassing. Charles grunted in agreement. Don't worry, Elizabeth. This year's party will be exactly as it should be. Our kind of people, celebrating our daughter in the manner to which we're accustomed. As the Rutherfords continued their party planning, blissfully unaware of the changes that fate had in store, Layla was finishing up her homework at the small kitchen table. She looked up at her mother, who was humming softly as she washed the dinner dishes. Mama, Layla said hesitantly. Maria turned, drying her hands on a threadbare dish towel. Yes, Mija. Layla took a deep breath. Do you think someone like me could ever dance at a fancy party? Like the ones Rebecca gets invited to? Maria's eyes softened as she crossed the room and knelt beside her daughter. Oh, Layla, she said, brushing a stray curl from her daughter's forehead. Someone like you can dance anywhere you want. On the biggest stages, at the fanciest parties, even on the moon if that's what you set your mind to. Layla giggled at the image of herself pirouetting across the lunar surface. Really? Really, Maria said firmly. But you have to remember something very important. No matter where you dance, no matter how big the stage or how fancy the party, the most important thing is the joy you bring to it. Your talent, your passion, your love for ballet. That's what makes you special. Not the color of your skin or the price of your tutu. Layla nodded solemnly, taking in her mother's words. I understand, Mama. Maria smiled and stood up, holding out her hand. Good. Now, how about we practice those arabesques? Show me what Miss Caroline taught you today. As Layla took her mother's hand and moved to the small clear space in their living room, she felt a surge of determination. She might not have the fanciest clothes or the biggest house, but she had talent, she had passion, and she had a mother who believed in her. And maybe, just maybe, that would be enough to make her dreams come true. Little did Layla know that her chance to prove herself was coming sooner than she could have ever imagined, at a party that would change everything. For her, for the Rutherfords, and for everyone who witnessed the magic of a talented young dancer refusing to let anything stand in her way. The morning of Emily Rutherford's extravagant birthday party dawned bright and clear, but at the Willowbrook Ballet Academy, a storm was brewing. The usually calm and orderly halls of the prestigious school were in chaos as news spread like wildfire. Rebecca, the star ballerina scheduled to perform at the Rutherford event, had fallen ill with a severe case of food poisoning. Miss Caroline paced anxiously outside the office of Mr. Hawkins, the Academy's director. Her normally serene face was etched with worry as she waited for him to finish his phone call. The door flew open, and Mr. Hawkins emerged, his face ashen. "This is a disaster," he muttered, running a hand through his thinning hair. "The Rutherfords would be furious. They will pull all their substantial donations if we don't deliver a top-notch performance." Miss Caroline took a deep breath. "Mr. Hawkins, I have a suggestion. It's unconventional, but I believe it could save the day." The director looked at her skeptically. "I'm all ears, Caroline. At this point, I'd consider anything." "Layla," Miss Caroline said simply. "She's young, yes, but her talent is undeniable. She knows Rebecca's routine by heart. I've seen her practicing it countless times. She could step in and perform beautifully." Mr. Hawkins' eyebrows shot up. "Layla? The scholarship student? Caroline, you can't be serious. She's just a child, and the Rutherfords specifically requested our best dancer." "Layla is our best dancer," Miss Caroline insisted, her voice filled with conviction. "Age is just a number. Her skill and passion far exceed many of our older students. Give her a chance, and I promise you won't be disappointed." The director hesitated, weighing his options. The Rutherfords' donation was crucial for the Academy's upcoming expansion, but putting an inexperienced 10-year-old on stage was a massive risk. And what about, well, you know the Rutherfords. They can be rather traditional in their views. Miss Caroline's eyes flashed with determination. "All the more reason to show them what true talent looks like, regardless of age or background. Layla deserves this chance, and I believe she'll win them over with her performance." After a moment of tense silence, Mr. Hawkins nodded slowly. "All right, Caroline. We'll give Layla a shot. But if this goes south, it's on your head." "I'll take full responsibility," Miss Caroline agreed, already turning to leave. "I'll go inform Layla and her mother right away." As Miss Caroline hurried down the hallway, Mr. Hawkins called after her, "Wait, what about the Rutherfords? Shouldn't we inform them of the change?" Miss Caroline paused, considering. A plan was forming in her mind, a risky one, but potentially brilliant. "No," she said finally. "Let's not tell them just yet. If Layla performs first, her talent will speak for itself. Once they see how incredible she is, they won't care about anything else." Mr. Hawkins looked uncertain, but nodded his agreement. "Very well. But Caroline, I hope you know what you're doing." "Trust me," she said with a confident smile. This could be the opportunity of a lifetime for Layla, and a chance for the Rutherfords to open their eyes to true talent. With that, Miss Caroline rushed off to break the news to Layla and her mother. She found them in one of the smaller practice rooms, where Layla was going through her warm-up routine, while Maria watched proudly from the sidelines. "Layla, Maria," Miss Caroline said, slightly out of breath as she entered the room. "I have some news that's going to change everything." Layla stopped mid-pirouette, her dark eyes wide with curiosity. "What is it, Miss Caroline?" The teacher took a deep breath, her excitement palpable. "Rebecca has fallen ill and can't perform at the Rutherford party today. I've recommended you as her replacement." For a moment, the room was silent. Then, Maria gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. But that's such an important event. Are you sure Layla is ready?" Miss Caroline nodded emphatically. "I've never been more certain of anything in my life." "Layla, you know Rebecca's routine by heart, don't you?" Layla nodded, her eyes shining with a mixture of excitement and nervousness. "Yes, I've practiced it so many times. But Miss Caroline, I'm just me. I'm not Rebecca." "No, you're not," Miss Caroline agreed, kneeling down to meet Layla's eyes. "You're Layla, and Layla is an extraordinary dancer with a gift that deserves to be seen. This is your chance to show everyone what you can do." Maria stepped forward, her face a mix of pride and concern. "But what about the Rutherfords? I've heard things about them. Will they be okay with Layla performing?" Ms. Caroline hesitated for a moment before deciding on honesty. We've decided not to inform them of the change just yet. We want Layla's talent to speak for itself. Once they see her dance, I'm confident they'll be won over. Maria's brow furrowed with worry. I don't know. Is that wise? What if they react badly? Mama, Layla said softly, reaching out to take her mother's hand. This is what we've been working so hard for. A chance to show what I can do. Please, can I try? Maria looked down at her daughter, seeing the determination in her eyes. After a moment, she nodded. Okay, Mija. If this is what you want, then we'll face whatever comes together. Layla's face broke into a radiant smile. She turned to Miss Caroline, practically bouncing with excitement. What do I need to do? When do we leave? Miss Caroline couldn't help but grin at Layla's enthusiasm. We leave in an hour. The performance is at 3 p.m. We'll run through the routine once more here, then head to the Rutherford estate. Are you ready for this, Layla? The young dancer squared her shoulders, her chin lifted with determination. I'm ready, Miss Caroline. I won't let you down. No. She snapped at a harried-looking decorator. I said the balloons should be silver and gold, not white and gold. Do I need to do everything myself? Charles Rutherford approached his wife cautiously, sensing her frayed nerves. Darling, perhaps you should take a moment to relax. Everything looks wonderful. Elizabeth whirled on him, her eyes flashing. Relax? How can I relax when everything has to be perfect? And now the ballet school is being cagey about the performance. They'd better not disappoint us, Charles. We're paying a small fortune for this party. Charles placed a calming hand on his wife's shoulder. I'm sure they know how important this is. They wouldn't dare let us down. Why don't you go check on Emily? Make sure she's getting ready. With a huff, Elizabeth nodded and stalked off towards the house. Charles watched her go, shaking his head slightly. He loved his wife, but sometimes her perfectionism and strong views could be exhausting. Upstairs, Emily sat at her vanity, a team of stylists fussing over her hair and makeup. The birthday girl's excitement was palpable, her blue eyes sparkling as she chatted animatedly. And then Rebecca's going to dance. Right here in our ballroom, she gushed to her favorite stylist, Mia. It's going to be just like a real ballet performance. Mia smiled indulgently as she carefully curled a lock of Emily's golden hair. That sounds wonderful, sweetie. You must be so excited. I am. Emily beamed. I've been practicing my own dance moves too. Maybe someday I'll be as good as Rebecca. Just then, Elizabeth entered the room, her critical gaze sweeping over her daughter. Emily, darling, you look lovely. But remember, a lady always maintains her composure. No more of this giddy chatter. Emily's smile faltered slightly, but she nodded obediently. Yes, mother. I'll try to be more composed. Elizabeth's expression softened a fraction. She crossed the room and placed a kiss on her daughter's forehead, careful not to smudge the freshly applied makeup. That's my girl. This party is going to be the talk of the town, and you'll be the belle of the ball. As Elizabeth left the room, Emily's excitement dimmed a little. She loved her parents, but sometimes she wished they would just let her be a normal kid. Still, she couldn't help but feel a thrill of anticipation for the upcoming performance. Little did she know that the dancer she was about to see would be very different from the one she was expecting. Back at the ballet academy, Layla had just finished her final run-through of the routine. She stood in the center of the practice room, breathing heavily but beaming with pride. Ms. Caroline applauded enthusiastically. Bravo, Layla. That was absolutely perfect. You're more than ready for this. Layla's mother, Maria, wiped a tear from her eye as she watched her daughter. Oh, Mija, you were beautiful. I'm so proud of you. Layla rushed over to hug her mother tightly. Thank you, Mama. I couldn't have done any of this without you. Ms. Caroline checked her watch. All right, ladies, it's time to go. Layla, go change into your costume. Maria, I've arranged for a car to take us to the Rutherford estate. As Layla disappeared into the changing room, Maria turned to Ms. Caroline, her voice low with concern. Are you sure about this? Not telling the Rutherfords, I mean. What if they react badly? Ms. Caroline squeezed Maria's hand reassuringly. I understand your worry, but I truly believe Layla's talent will overcome any preconceived notions they might have. This is her chance to shine, and I have faith that she'll dazzle everyone in that room. Maria nodded, trying to push down her anxiety. You're right. Layla deserves this opportunity. We'll face whatever happens together. A few minutes later, Layla emerged from the changing room, resplendent in a sparkling white tutu. Her dark skin seemed to glow against the pristine fabric, and her eyes shone with determination and excitement. "I'm ready," she announced, her voice steady and confident. Miss Caroline smiled proudly. "Yes, you are. Now, let's go show the world what you can do." As they left the academy and climbed into the waiting car, none of them could have predicted the events that were about to unfold. The stage was set for a performance that would challenge prejudices, ignite passions, and potentially change lives forever. Layla's moment had arrived, and she was ready to dance her way into history. The sleek black car carrying Layla, Maria, and Miss Caroline pulled up to the imposing gates of the Rutherford mansion. As they wound their way up the long, tree-lined driveway, Layla pressed her face against the window, her eyes wide with wonder at the sprawling estate. "Mama, look at how big it is," she whispered, her breath fogging up the glass. "It's like a castle from a fairy tale." Maria squeezed her daughter's hand, a mixture of pride and nervousness swirling in her stomach. "Remember, Mija, it's not the size of the house that matters. It's what's in your heart that counts." Miss Caroline nodded in agreement. "Exactly. And Layla, your heart is full of talent and passion. That's what's going to shine through today." As the car came to a stop in front of the mansion's grand entrance, Layla took a deep breath, squaring her shoulders. "I'm ready," she said, her voice steady despite the butterflies fluttering in her stomach. They were greeted at the door by a harried-looking woman clutching a clipboard. "You must be the performer," she said, barely glancing at them as she ushered them inside. "I'm Mrs. Patel, the party coordinator. We're running a bit behind schedule, so if you could please hurry." As they followed Mrs. Patel through the opulent foyer, Layla couldn't help but gape at the crystal chandeliers, marble floors, and priceless artwork adorning the walls. It was a world away from their modest apartment, and for a moment, she felt a twinge of intimidation. Mrs. Patel led them to a small room off to the side of the main ballroom. "You can wait here until it's time for the performance," she instructed. "There's water and some light refreshments if you need them. I'll come get you when it's time." As the coordinator hurried off, Miss Caroline turned to Layla. "All right, let's do some light stretches to warm up. Maria, why don't you go find a seat in the audience? We'll be fine here." Maria hesitated, looking at her daughter with concern. "Are you sure? I can stay if you want me to, Mija." Layla smiled bravely. "It's okay, Mama. I'll be fine with Miss Caroline. Go enjoy the party." With a final hug and a whispered, "I love you," Maria reluctantly left to join the other guests. Meanwhile, in the grand ballroom, the Rutherford's birthday extravaganza was in full swing. Elegantly dressed guests mingled, sipping champagne and nibbling on exquisite hors d'oeuvres. A string quartet played softly in the corner, providing a refined backdrop to the chatter of the town's elite. Elizabeth Rutherford glided through the crowd, the perfect picture of a gracious hostess in her designer gown and glittering jewelry. But those who knew her well could see the tension in her smile and the sharp glint in her eyes as she surveyed every detail of the party. "Charles," she hissed, cornering her husband by the champagne fountain. "Have you seen the ballet dancer yet? She should have been here by now." Charles shook his head, taking a sip of his drink. "I'm sure she'll be here soon, dear. You know how artists can be, fashionably late and all that." Elizabeth's perfectly plucked eyebrows drew together in a frown. "Well, she'd better not be too late. This performance is the centerpiece of Emily's party, and I won't have it ruined by some tardy prima donna." As if on cue, Mrs. Patel appeared at Elizabeth's elbow. "Mrs. Rutherford, the dancer has arrived and is preparing backstage. We can begin the performance whenever you're ready." A look of relief washed over Elizabeth's face. "Excellent. Give her 5 more minutes to prepare, then we'll gather everyone for the show." Unaware of the drama unfolding around her impending performance, Layla was in the small waiting room, going through her final stretches and mental preparations. Miss Caroline watched her with a mixture of pride and nervous anticipation. "Remember, Layla," she said softly, "just dance like you do in practice. Forget about the audience. Forget about where you are. Just feel the music and let your body express it." Layla nodded, taking a deep breath. "I will, Miss Caroline. I'll make you proud." A gentle knock on the door interrupted them. Mrs. Patel poked her head in, her expression harried. "It's time." Are you ready? Layla stood up straight, smoothing down her tutu. I'm ready. As they followed Mrs. Patel to the wing of the makeshift stage, Layla caught a glimpse of the crowded ballroom. Her eyes widened at the sea of unfamiliar faces, all dressed in their finest attire. For a moment, a wave of panic threatened to overwhelm her. But then, in the crowd, she spotted her mother. Maria stood near the back, looking slightly out of place in her simple dress, but her face shone with love and pride as she caught Layla's eye. Layla felt a surge of courage. She could do this. She would do this for her mama, for Miss Caroline, and for herself. In the center of the room, Elizabeth Rutherford tapped a spoon against her crystal champagne flute, the clear rings silencing the chatter of the guests. Ladies and gentlemen, she announced, her voice carrying across the room, as a special treat for my darling Emily's birthday, we have arranged a performance by the star dancer of the Willowbrook Ballet Academy. Please take your seats and enjoy the show. There was a rustle of movement as guests found their seats. The Rutherfords took their place in the front row, Emily bouncing excitedly between her parents. As the lights dimmed and a hush fell over the audience, Mrs. Patel gave Layla a little push. You're on, she whispered. Taking a final deep breath, Layla stepped out onto the stage. The spotlight hit her, momentarily blinding her to the audience. As her eyes adjusted, she took her starting position, waiting for the music to begin. The first notes of Tchaikovsky's Dance of the Sugar Plum Fairy filled the air, and Layla began to move. Her initial steps were careful, precise, but as the familiar melody washed over her, she felt herself relaxing into the dance. In the audience, there was a collective intake of breath as people realized that the dancer on stage was not who they had expected. Whispers began to ripple through the crowd. Who is that? That's not Rebecca. Is that a black girl? In the front row, Elizabeth Rutherford's face had frozen in a mask of shock and growing anger. She turned to her husband, her voice a furious whisper. Charles, what is the meaning of this? This is not the dancer we paid for. Charles looked equally confused and dismayed. I don't know, Elizabeth. There must have been some mistake. On stage, Layla was oblivious to the murmurs in the audience. She had entered that magical space where nothing existed but her body and the music. Her movements were fluid, graceful, each position executed with precision and feeling that belied her young age. As Layla moved into a series of complex turns, a hush began to fall over the audience. Despite their initial shock, they couldn't help but be drawn in by the young dancer's undeniable talent and the emotion she poured into every movement. Emily, the birthday girl, was leaning forward in her seat, her eyes wide with wonder. Mommy, she whispered, tugging on Elizabeth's sleeve, she's amazing. Look how she spins. But Elizabeth wasn't looking at Layla's spins. Her face was flushed with a mixture of embarrassment and rage. She gripped Charles's arm, her nails digging into his sleeve. This is unacceptable, she hissed. How dare they send this child to perform at our daughter's party? And a black child, no less. What will people think? Charles shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He had to admit the young dancer was incredibly talented, but he knew better than to voice that opinion to his wife right now. Perhaps there was an emergency, he suggested weakly. Maybe Rebecca fell ill? Then they should have informed us. Elizabeth snapped. We would have canceled the performance rather than this. As Layla moved into the second half of her routine, she began to feel the energy of the room changing. The initial tension was melting away, replaced by a growing sense of awe. She allowed herself a small smile as she executed a particularly challenging sequence of steps. In the back of the room, Maria watched her daughter with tears in her eyes. Every graceful movement, every perfect turn was a testament to Layla's hard work and dedication. She felt a tap on her shoulder and turned to see an elegantly dressed woman smiling at her. Is that your daughter? The woman whispered. Maria nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. She's extraordinary, the woman said warmly. You must be so proud. Maria's heart swelled. I am, she managed to say, more than I can express. As the performance continued, more and more of the guests found themselves captivated by Layla's dance. Looks of surprise and confusion gave way to expressions of appreciation and admiration. Even some of the most traditional members of the town's elite couldn't deny the sheer talent they were witnessing. But in the front row, the Rutherfords' anger continued to simmer. Elizabeth's face was now an alarming shade of red, her lips pressed into a thin line. Charles kept glancing nervously between his wife and the young dancer on stage, unsure of how to handle the situation. Emily, however, remained blissfully unaware of her parents' distress. She was completely entranced by Layla's performance, her little hands clapping softly in time with the music. As Layla moved into the final sequence of her routine, she felt a surge of confidence. The music swelled, and she launched into a series of fouettes, her leg whipping around as she spun, once, twice, 3 times, 10 times in total, each one perfect and precise. A collective gasp went up from the audience. Even those who knew little about ballet could recognize the incredible skill and control required for such a feat, especially from such a young dancer. Elizabeth Rutherford's mouth fell open in shock. Despite her anger, she couldn't help but be impressed by the technical proficiency she was witnessing. But she quickly schooled her features back into a scowl. "It doesn't matter how well she dances," she muttered to Charles. "This is not what we asked for. This is not what we paid for." Charles nodded absently, but his eyes remained fixed on Layla. He had to admit, if only to himself, that he had never seen such a moving performance, not even from the professional companies they sometimes attended in the city. As the music reached its crescendo, Layla prepared for her final move, a grand jeté across the stage. She took a deep breath, gathering all her strength and emotion. Then, with a powerful leap, she soared through the air, her arms outstretched, her face a picture of pure joy and freedom. For a moment, it seemed as if she was suspended in midair, defying gravity itself. The audience held its collective breath, caught in the magic of the moment. Then Layla landed softly, gracefully, sinking in her final pose as the last notes of music faded away. For a heartbeat, there was complete silence in the ballroom. Then, as if a dam had broken, applause erupted from every corner of the room. People rose to their feet, cheering and clapping with genuine enthusiasm. In the back, Maria was openly crying now, her hands pressed to her heart as she watched her daughter take a deep bow on stage. Miss Caroline, who had been watching from the wings, rushed out to join Layla, enveloping her in a proud hug. Even some of the most reserved guests were smiling and clapping heartily. The woman who had spoken to Maria earlier leaned over to her companion, saying loudly enough for those around her to hear, "Now that, my dear, is what true talent looks like. Color and age be damned." But in the front row, the Rutherfords remained seated, a cold island of displeasure in a sea of celebration. Elizabeth's face was now pale with fury, her hands clenched into fists in her lap. Charles looked torn, his ingrained prejudices warring with the undeniable appreciation he felt for the performance he had just witnessed. Emily, however, was on her feet, clapping and cheering as loudly as anyone. "Mommy, Daddy, did you see?" she exclaimed, her face glowing with excitement. "She was so beautiful. Can I learn to dance like that?" Elizabeth grabbed her daughter's arm, pulling her back into her seat. "Hush, Emily," she said sharply. "That's quite enough." But Emily was too excited to be silenced. "But Mommy, she was even better than Rebecca. I've never seen anyone dance like that before." Elizabeth's nostrils flared as she took a deep breath, clearly trying to control her temper. "Emily, I said that's enough. We'll discuss this later." On stage, Layla was still breathing heavily from her performance, her face flushed with exertion and joy. As the applause continued, she took another deep bow, her heart soaring. She had done it. She had danced her very best, and people had appreciated it. As she straightened up, her eyes met Emily's in the front row. The birthday girl was beaming at her, clapping enthusiastically despite her mother's obvious disapproval. Layla couldn't help but smile back, giving Emily a little wave. This small interaction seemed to be the final straw for Elizabeth Rutherford. She stood up abruptly, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. "Charles," she said, her voice tight with barely controlled rage, "I think it's time we had a word with the party coordinator." Charles nodded, rising to his feet as well. He cast one last glance at Layla, a flicker of something almost like admiration in his eyes, before following his wife as she stormed towards Mrs. Patel. Oblivious to the brewing storm, Layla stepped off the stage, immediately engulfed in a warm hug from Miss Caroline. "Oh, Layla," Miss Caroline said, her voice thick with emotion, "you were absolutely magnificent. I've never been more proud." Before Layla could respond, she felt another pair of arms wrap around her. "Mija," Maria's voice was choked with happy tears, "my beautiful, talented girl. You danced like an angel." Layla hugged her mother tightly, her own eyes filling with tears of joy and relief. "I did it, Mama," she whispered. "I really did it." As they embraced, several guests approached, eager to congratulate the young dancer. Layla found herself surrounded by smiling faces and words of praise. "Young lady, that was an extraordinary performance. I've never seen such talent in one so young. You must tell us where you train. My granddaughter would love to take lessons." Layla blushed at the compliments, thanking each person politely as Miss Caroline had taught her. She felt as if she was floating on air, hardly able to believe that her dream of dancing for a real audience had come true. Meanwhile, across the room, a very different scene was unfolding. Elizabeth Rutherford had cornered Mrs. Patel, her voice rising with each word despite her attempt to keep the conversation private. "How dare you?" she hissed, her face inches from the startled coordinators. "How dare you substitute our contracted performer without so much as a word of warning?" Mrs. Patel held up her hands, placatingly. "Mrs. Rutherford, I assure you, this was not my decision. The ballet school informed me of a last-minute change, but they assured me that this young lady was their most talented student. That's not the point." Elizabeth snapped. "We had an agreement. We paid for a specific performer, and instead, you've made us the laughingstock of the entire town." Charles placed a hand on his wife's arm, trying to calm her. "Elizabeth, dear, perhaps we should discuss this somewhere more private." But Elizabeth was beyond caring about propriety now. "I want that girl and her enablers out of my house this instant. And you can be sure that the ballet school will be hearing from our lawyers about this breach of contract." Their raised voices were starting to attract attention. Guests were turning to look, murmurs of confusion and disapproval rippling through the crowd. Back by the stage, Layla was still basking in the afterglow of her performance when she noticed the commotion near the back of the room. She saw Mrs. Rutherford gesticulating angrily, her face contorted with rage, while Mr. Rutherford tried unsuccessfully to calm her. Layla tugged on Miss Caroline's sleeve, her smile fading. "Miss Caroline, what's happening over there? Why does Mrs. Rutherford look so angry?" Miss Caroline followed Layla's gaze, her heart sinking as she took in the scene. She had hoped the Rutherfords would be won over by Layla's talent, but it was clear that her gamble had not paid off as she'd hoped. "Don't worry about it, Layla," she said, trying to keep her voice light. "You just focus on how wonderfully you danced. That's all that matters." But Layla's perceptive eyes had already caught the tension in the room. She saw the way some of the guests were now looking at her, not with admiration, but with a mixture of pity and discomfort. The bubble of joy that had surrounded her began to deflate. Maria, too, had noticed the commotion. She moved closer to Layla, placing a protective arm around her daughter's shoulders. "Perhaps we should go, Miss Caroline," she said quietly. "I don't want Layla to be in the middle of whatever this is." Before Miss Caroline could respond, Emily broke away from her parents and came running over to Layla, her face beaming with excitement. "You were amazing," Emily gushed, grabbing Layla's hands. "I've never seen anyone dance like that before. Can you teach me how to spin like you do?" Layla, momentarily distracted from the tension in the room, smiled at the younger girl. "Thank you," she said shyly. "I've been practicing those spins for a long time. Maybe you could come to our school someday and learn." Emily nodded enthusiastically. "Oh yes, I'd love that. Maybe we could be friends and dance together." The innocent interaction between the two girls seemed to be the final straw for Elizabeth Rutherford. She marched over, her heels clicking ominously on the polished floor. "Emily," she snapped, grabbing her daughter's arm. "Come away from there this instant." Emily looked up at her mother, confusion and hurt in her eyes. "But Mom, I was just talking to Dash. I said come away." Elizabeth's voice was sharp enough to make several nearby guests wince. She turned her icy glare on Layla, Miss Caroline, and Maria. I think it's time for you to leave. You've caused quite enough disruption for one day. Maria instinctively pulled Layla closer, her chin lifting defiantly despite the tremor in her voice. My daughter was invited to perform here. She did nothing wrong. Elizabeth's eyes narrowed dangerously. Invited? Hardly. We were deceived, sold a bill of goods. We paid for a professional performance, not some charity case. The cruel words hung in the air, causing a ripple of shocked murmurs through the watching crowd. Layla felt as if she'd been slapped, tears welling up in her eyes despite her best efforts to hold them back. Miss Caroline stepped forward, her usually gentle demeanor hardening. Mrs. Rutherford, I understand you're upset about the change in performers, but I assure you, Layla is one of our most talented students. Her performance today was nothing short of exceptional. Exceptional? Elizabeth scoffed. It was inappropriate and embarrassing. This is not the image we want associated with our family or our daughter's birthday. Charles Rutherford, who had been hovering uncomfortably in the background, finally spoke up. Elizabeth, dear, perhaps we're being a bit hasty. The girl did dance quite well, but Elizabeth was beyond reason. I want him out, Charles. Now. The tension in the room had reached a breaking point. Guests were whispering among themselves, some looking ashamed, others angry, and a few even gathering their things to leave in disgust at the Rutherfords' behavior. Layla, overwhelmed by the sudden turn of events, buried her face in her mother's side, her small shoulders shaking with suppressed sobs. All the joy and pride she had felt just moments ago had been crushed under the weight of Mrs. Rutherford's cruel words. Maria stroked her daughter's hair, her own eyes glistening with unshed tears of anger and hurt. She looked at Miss Caroline, a silent question in her gaze. Miss Caroline nodded, her lips pressed into a thin line. We'll go, she said quietly. But know this, Mrs. Rutherford, you've just witnessed a performance by a future star. One day, you'll regret the words you've spoken here. As they turned to leave, a voice rang out from the crowd. Wait! All eyes turned to see an elegant older woman making her way through the parting guests. Layla recognized her as the woman who had spoken to her mother earlier. I'm Madame Du Bois, the woman announced, her voice carrying authority. I sit on the board of the National Ballet Company, and I must say, I am appalled by what I've witnessed here today. Elizabeth blanched slightly, recognizing the name and the influence it carried. Madame Du Bois, I can explain dash. But Madame Du Bois held up a hand, silencing her. There is no explanation needed for such blatant racism and cruelty, Mrs. Rutherford. What I saw today was a young girl with extraordinary talent being humiliated for no reason other than the color of her skin. She turned to Layla, her expression softening. My dear, you danced beautifully today. In all my years in the ballet world, I have rarely seen such raw talent and emotion in one so young. Layla lifted her tear-stained face, hope flickering in her eyes. Really? She whispered. Madame Du Bois nodded, smiling warmly. Really? In fact, I'd like to offer you a scholarship to our summer intensive program. With training like that, you could have a very bright future in ballet. A collective gasp went through the room. Summer intensives at the National Ballet Company were highly coveted and usually reserved for much older, more experienced dancers. Elizabeth Rutherford's face had gone from red to white, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. But, Madame Du Bois turned back to the Rutherfords, her expression hardening again. As for you, Mr. and Mrs. Rutherford, I suggest you take a long, hard look at yourselves and the example you're setting for your daughter. Ballet, like all art, is about beauty, emotion, and human connection. It knows no color, no class boundaries. What you've displayed here today is the antithesis of everything ballet stands for. With that, she turned on her heel and walked out, leaving a stunned silence in her wake. The spell was broken by Emily, who had been watching the whole scene with wide, confused eyes. She suddenly broke free from her mother's grip and ran to Layla, throwing her arms around the older girl in a fierce hug. I'm sorry my mom was mean to you, she said, her voice muffled against Layla's tutu. I think you're the best dancer ever, and I want to be just like you when I grow up. Layla, overwhelmed by the rapid turn of events, hugged Emily back, a wobbly smile forming on her lips. Thank you, Emily, she whispered. Maybe we can dance together someday. As Maria and Ms. Caroline gently led Layla out of the ballroom, the remaining guests began to disperse, many shooting disapproving looks at the Rutherfords as they left. The grand birthday party that was meant to be the social event of the season had disintegrated into a PR disaster for the once untouchable family. Elizabeth Rutherford stood in the center of the now empty ballroom, her carefully crafted world crumbling around her. Charles placed a hand on her shoulder, but she shrugged it off, her eyes fixed on the spot where Layla had danced. For a moment, just a moment, she allowed herself to see past her prejudices and recognize the truth. She had witnessed something extraordinary today, a raw talent that came along once in a generation. And in her blind adherence to her outdated beliefs, she had not only missed the opportunity to be part of something special, but had also exposed the ugliness in her heart for all to see. As the last of the guests filed out, Emily tugged on her mother's dress. "Mom," she said softly, "can I still learn to dance like Layla?" Elizabeth looked down at her daughter, seeing the hope and admiration shining in her eyes. In that moment, she realized that her actions today had not only hurt an innocent child, but had also set a terrible example for her own daughter. With a heavy sigh, Elizabeth knelt down to Emily's level. "We'll see, sweetheart," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "We'll see." As the Rutherford family stood alone in their grand, empty ballroom, the faint sound of applause could still be heard from outside. Layla, surrounded by her mother, Ms. Caroline, and a group of admirers, was taking one final bow on the mansion's front steps before departing. The day had not gone as anyone had expected, but as Layla climbed into the car, clutching the card Madame Du Bois had pressed into her hand, she felt a glimmer of hope. Despite the cruelty she had faced, her talent had shone through, opening doors she had never dreamed possible. As they drove away from the Rutherford mansion, Layla leaned her head on her mother's shoulder, exhausted but quietly triumphant. She had faced her fears, danced her heart out, and in doing so, had taken the first steps towards changing not just her own life, but the perceptions of those around her. The echoes of her performance would continue to resonate long after the last guest had left the Rutherfords' ill-fated party, a testament to the power of talent, perseverance, and the undeniable magic of dance. The days following the Rutherford party were a whirlwind for Layla and her mother. News of the young dancer's extraordinary performance, and the subsequent drama, had spread like wildfire through their small town. It seemed that everywhere they went, people were whispering and pointing, some with admiration, others with barely concealed disdain. For Layla, the emotional roller coaster was overwhelming. One moment, she was soaring high on the memory of her perfect performance and Madame Du Bois' offer. The next, she was crumpling under the weight of Mrs. Rutherford's cruel words, which echoed in her mind during quiet moments. Maria watched her daughter closely, her heart aching for the burden Layla now carried. She had always known that Layla would face challenges as a black ballerina, but she had hoped to shield her from such blatant racism for a little longer. One evening, as they sat at their small kitchen table eating dinner, Maria reached across and took Layla's hand. "Mija," she said softly, "how are you really feeling about everything that happened?" Layla pushed her food around her plate, avoiding her mother's gaze. "I don't know, Mama," she finally admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "Sometimes I feel so happy and proud, like I could dance on air. But then I remember Mrs. Rutherford's face, how angry she was just because of me. And it makes me wonder if I should even keep dancing." Maria's heart clenched at her daughter's words. She squeezed Layla's hand tightly. "Layla, look at me," she said, her voice firm but gentle. When Layla raised her eyes, Maria continued, "What happened at that party was not your fault. Mrs. Rutherford's anger and prejudice have nothing to do with your talent or your worth. You danced beautifully, and you touched so many people with your performance. Don't let one person's cruelty dim your light." Layla nodded slowly, a small smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. "Madame Du Bois did say I was talented," she said, a hint of pride creeping into her voice. "She did," Maria agreed, smiling. "And she offered you an amazing opportunity. Which reminds me, we need to talk about that summer intensive program." Layla's eyes widened. Do you think I could really go?" Maria took a deep breath. The truth was, she had been agonizing over this decision since the moment Madame Du Bois had made the offer. The opportunity was incredible, but the program was in New York City, hundreds of miles away from their small town. The thought of sending her 10-year-old daughter to a big city for the entire summer made her stomach churn with anxiety. But as she looked at Layla's hopeful face, she knew what she had to do. "Yes, Mija," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "If that's what you want, we'll find a way to make it happen." Layla's face lit up like the sun breaking through clouds. She leaped from her chair and threw her arms around her mother. "Oh, Mama, thank you, thank you, thank you." As Maria held her daughter close, she sent up a silent prayer. She didn't know how they would manage it financially or logistically, but she was determined to give Layla this chance. Her daughter's talent deserved to be nurtured, no matter the sacrifices they would have to make. The next day, Maria and Layla went to the Willowbrook Ballet Academy to discuss the summer program with Miss Caroline. The teacher was overjoyed to hear that Layla wanted to accept Madame Dubois' offer. "This is an incredible opportunity, Layla," Miss Caroline said, her eyes shining with pride. "The National Ballet Company's Summer Intensive is one of the most prestigious programs in the country. It could open so many doors for you." Layla nodded, excitement bubbling up inside her. But then a thought occurred to her, and her face fell slightly. "But Miss Caroline, how will we afford it? I know these programs are expensive, and we're already struggling to pay for my regular classes." Miss Caroline and Maria exchanged a look. "Well," Miss Caroline said slowly, "I've been thinking about that. I believe you're worthy of the Academy's full scholarship, Layla. It's usually reserved for older students, but after your performance at the Rutherford party, I think I can convince the board to make an exception." Layla gasped, her eyes widening. "Really? You do that for me?" Miss Caroline smiled warmly. "Of course, Layla. Your talent deserves to be nurtured, and I'll do everything in my power to make sure you have the opportunities you deserve." As they left the academy, Layla was practically floating with happiness. But Maria couldn't shake a nagging worry. "Miss Caroline," she said quietly, holding her daughter back for a moment, What about people like the Rutherfords? Will Layla face more of that kind of treatment in New York?" Miss Caroline's face softened with understanding. "I wish I could say no, Maria. But the truth is, ballet is still a very traditional world, and Layla may face some challenges. But," she added, seeing the fear in Maria's eyes, "she'll also find allies and friends who will see her for the incredible dancer she is. And every time she proves someone like Mrs. Rutherford wrong, she'll be paving the way for other young dancers who look like her." Maria nodded, drawing strength from Ms. Caroline's words. She watched as Layla twirled happily on the sidewalk, her face glowing with joy and anticipation. Whatever challenges lay ahead, Maria knew they would face them together. The next few weeks were a flurry of activity as they prepared for Layla's summer adventure. There were forms to fill out, medical checks to complete, and countless little details to arrange. Maria picked up extra shifts at both her jobs, determined to provide Layla with everything she might need in New York. As news of Layla's scholarship and acceptance into the summer program spread, the community's reaction was mixed. Many people, including Layla's classmates and their parents, were thrilled for her. They organized a small fundraiser to help with her travel expenses, and Layla was touched by their support. But there were others who muttered darkly about special treatment and lowering standards. These comments, often overheard in grocery store aisles or on street corners, cut Maria to the quick. She did her best to shield Layla from the worst of it, but she couldn't protect her daughter from every sideways glance or whispered comment. Through it all, Layla threw herself into her dancing with renewed passion. She spent every spare moment in the studio, determined to be as prepared as possible for the intensive program. Ms. Caroline worked with her tirelessly, pushing her to new heights and helping her refine her technique. One afternoon, about a week before Layla was set to leave for New York, Maria arrived at the studio to pick her up and found her daughter in tears. Alarmed, she rushed to Layla's side. "Mija, what's wrong? Are you hurt?" Layla shook her head, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "No, Mama. I'm scared. What if I'm not good enough? What if everyone there is better than me?" Maria's heart ached for her daughter. She knelt down, taking Layla's small hands in her own. "Layla, listen to me. You are more than good enough. You've worked so hard, and your talent is a gift. But even if there are dancers there who can do things you can't yet, that's okay. This program is about learning and growing. You don't have to be the best. You just have to be your best. Layla nodded, sniffling. But what if there are more people like Mrs. Rutherford? What if they don't want me there because I'm black? Maria took a deep breath, choosing her words carefully. Mija, I wish I could promise you that you'll never face people like Mrs. Rutherford again. But the truth is, there might be some people who judge you unfairly because of the color of your skin. But remember this, their prejudice is their weakness, not yours. Your talent, your hard work, your beautiful spirit, those are your strengths. And every time you dance, every time you refuse to let their words stop you, you're showing them how wrong they are. Layla straightened up, a determined glint in her eye. Like Misty Copeland, she asked, referring to her idol, the first African-American woman to be promoted to principal dancer in American Ballet Theater's 75-year history. Maria smiled, her heart swelling with pride. Exactly like Misty Copeland. You're part of a legacy of strong, talented black ballerinas who are changing the face of ballet. It won't always be easy, but you're not alone. Layla hugged her mother tightly, drawing strength from her words. When she pulled back, her tears were gone, replaced by a look of fierce determination. I'm going to make you proud, Mama, she said. I'm going to dance so beautifully that even people like Mrs. Rutherford won't be able to look away. The day of Layla's departure arrived all too quickly. The small airport was buzzing with activity as Maria, Miss Caroline, and a group of Layla's classmates gathered to see her off. Layla, wearing a Willowbrook Ballet Academy sweatshirt over her favorite leggings, clutched her dance bag tightly, a mix of excitement and nerves written across her face. As the final boarding call for Layla's flight was announced, Maria knelt down to give her daughter one last hug. Remember, Mija, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. You are strong, you are talented, and you are loved. No matter what happens in New York, I am so proud of you. Layla hugged her mother fiercely, blinking back tears. I love you, Mama. I'll make you proud, I promise. With a final wave, Layla made her way through security. Maria watched until her daughter's small figure disappeared from view, her heart simultaneously bursting with pride and aching with the impending separation. Miss Caroline placed a comforting hand on Maria's shoulder. She'll be fine, she said softly. Layla's stronger than she knows. Maria nodded, wiping away a stray tear. I know, she said, but it doesn't make it any easier to watch her go. As they left the airport, Maria couldn't shake the feeling that everything was about to change. Her little girl was taking her first steps into a bigger world, and all Maria could do now was hope that the foundation they'd built together would be strong enough to weather whatever challenges lay ahead. The summer seemed to fly by in a whirlwind of phone calls, text messages, and video chats. Layla's voice was always filled with excitement as she recounted her days at the intensive, the grueling classes, the new techniques she was learning, the friends she was making. There were hard days too, moments of homesickness and self-doubt, but Layla faced each challenge with a determination that made Maria's heart swell with pride. Back in their small town, Maria threw herself into work, picking up even more hours to save for Layla's future. The Rutherford incident had faded from the town's collective memory, replaced by newer gossip, but its effects lingered. Maria noticed that some people who had once been friendly now avoided her gaze or crossed the street when they saw her coming. It hurt, but she held her head high, focusing on the supportive community that had rallied around Layla. As the end of the summer approached, Maria received an unexpected phone call. It was Madame Du Bois, her elegant voice crackling over the line. Mrs. Johnson, she said, I hope you'll forgive the intrusion, but I wanted to speak with you about Layla. Maria's heart leapt into her throat. Is everything all right? She asked, 1,000 worst-case scenarios flashing through her mind. Everything is more than all right, Madame Du Bois assured her. In fact, that's why I'm calling. Layla has shown extraordinary progress this summer. Her talent, which was already remarkable, has blossomed in ways I've rarely seen. Pride and relief washed over Maria in equal measure. That's wonderful to hear, she said. Layla has worked so hard. Indeed she has, Madame Du Bois agreed. Which brings me to the reason for my call. Mrs. Johnson, I believe Layla has the potential to become a truly exceptional ballerina, the kind that comes along once in a generation. But to reach that potential, she needs intensive, consistent training at the highest level. Maria's breath caught in her throat. She had a feeling she knew where this conversation was going, and it both thrilled and terrified her. "I'd like to offer Layla a full scholarship to attend our year-round program here in New York," Madame Du Bois continued. "She would live in our student housing, attend academic classes tailored to aspiring professional dancers, and receive daily training from some of the best instructors in the world." For a moment, Maria couldn't speak. The opportunity was incredible, beyond anything she had ever dreamed for Layla. But the thought of her daughter living so far away, of missing out on her day-to-day life, made her heart ache. I don't know what to say," Maria finally managed. "It's an amazing offer, but Layla is so young, and I don't know if I could bear to be apart from her for so long." Madame Du Bois' voice softened. "I understand, Mrs. Johnson. It's a big decision, and not one to be made lightly. But I want you to know that we take the welfare of our young students very seriously. Layla would be well cared for, and we have programs in place to ensure that students stay connected with their families." Maria nodded, even though Madame Du Bois couldn't see her. "Thank you," she said. "I'll need to discuss this with Layla, of course. Can I let you know our decision in a few days?" "Of course," Madame Du Bois replied. "Take all the time you need. And Mrs. Johnson, whatever you decide, you should be very proud of your daughter. She's quite remarkable." After hanging up, Maria sat at the kitchen table, her mind whirling. She thought of all the sacrifices they had made for Layla's dancing, all the extra shifts and penny pinching. She thought of the joy on Layla's face when she danced, the determination in her eyes when she faced challenges. And she thought of her own dreams for her daughter, dreams of a life filled with opportunities she herself had never had. When Layla called that evening for their nightly check-in, Maria's heart was pounding. She listened as Layla chatted excitedly about her day, about a particularly challenging combination she had finally mastered. "Layla," Maria said when there was a pause in her daughter's chatter, "I got a call from Madame Du Bois today." "Oh." Layla's voice was curious. "What did she say?" Maria took a deep breath. "She offered you a full scholarship to attend the year-round program in New York. You'd live there, go to school there, and train with the company every day." There was a moment of stunned silence on the other end of the line. Then, in a small voice, Layla asked, "Really? She wants me to stay?" "Yes, Mija. She says you have extraordinary potential." Maria paused, then added softly, "But it's a big decision. You'd be living far from home, from me. It would be very different from your life here." Layla was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice was thoughtful. "It would be hard to be away from you, Mama. But I love it here. I'm learning so much, and I feel like I'm finally in a place where I really belong." Maria closed her eyes, feeling a mixture of pride and pain. Her little girl was growing up, finding her place in the world. "I know, Mija, and if this is what you really want, we'll find a way to make it work." "Can I think about it?" Layla asked. "I want to be sure." "Of course," Maria said. "Take all the time you need. Whatever you decide. I'm so proud of you." The next few days were a blur of long-distance conversations, tears, and careful consideration. In the end, the decision was Layla's, but it was one they made together as a family. When Maria called Madame Du Bois to accept the offer, her voice was a mixture of pride and bittersweet emotion. "We've decided to accept," she said. "Layla wants to pursue this opportunity." Madame Du Bois was delighted. "Excellent. We'll make all the necessary arrangements. And Mrs. Johnson, please know that we'll take good care of Layla." The next few weeks were a whirlwind of preparations. Layla returned home briefly, only to pack up her life for the move to New York. The community rallied around them once again, organizing a farewell party and helping with last-minute details. On the day of Layla's departure, the small airport was packed with well-wishers. Miss Caroline hugged Layla tightly, whispering words of encouragement. As Maria embraced her daughter one last time before she boarded the plane, she felt a tap on her shoulder. To her shock, she turned to see Emily Rutherford and her father, Charles. Emily was clutching a small gift bag. "Mr. Rutherford," Maria said stiffly, instinctively pulling Layla closer. Charles looked uncomfortable, but determined. "Mrs. Johnson, Layla, we owe you an apology. What happened at Emily's party was inexcusable. We've come to wish Layla good luck and to make amends, if you'll let us." Emily stepped forward, holding out the gift bag to Layla. "I made this for you," she said shyly. Mom didn't want me to come, but Dad said it was the right thing to do. Layla accepted the gift, her eyes wide with surprise. Inside was a hand-painted pair of pointe shoes, decorated with swirls of gold and tiny stars. Thank you, Layla said softly, a small smile forming on her lips. Charles cleared his throat. Mrs. Johnson, I want you to know that my wife and I have had many discussions since the party. She's been asked to step down from several charity boards, and we've lost a lot of standing in the community. It's been a wake-up call for us. Maria nodded, unsure how to respond. But Layla, with the directness of youth, asked, Is Mrs. Rutherford sorry too? Charles sighed. She's learning. It's not easy for her to change, but she's trying. Seeing the consequences of her actions has been hard for her. As they said their goodbyes, Maria felt a weight lift from her shoulders. The Rutherfords' apology couldn't erase what had happened, but it was a step in the right direction. With a final wave, Layla boarded the plane, clutching her new pointe shoes and carrying the dreams of her entire community with her. The years that followed were challenging, but rewarding. Layla threw herself into her training, pushing herself to new heights. Maria visited as often as she could, marveling at her daughter's growth both as a dancer and as a young woman. 3 years later, Maria sat in the audience of a grand theater in New York, her heart pounding with anticipation. It was the night of Layla's first major performance with the company's corps de ballet. As the curtain rose, Maria's eyes immediately found her daughter among the dancers. Layla moved with grace and power, her every movement a testament to years of hard work and dedication. As she danced, Maria saw flashes of the little girl who used to twirl in their tiny living room, now transformed into a poised and confident young woman. In the audience, Maria spotted Madame Du Bois, beaming with pride. And to her surprise, a few rows ahead sat the Rutherfords, Elizabeth included. The woman's face was unreadable, but she didn't take her eyes off Layla throughout the performance. As the final notes faded and the dancers took their bows, the theater erupted in applause. Layla's smile was radiant as she basked in the moment she had dreamed of for so long. After the performance, as Layla was surrounded by well-wishers, Elizabeth Rutherford approached hesitantly. You danced beautifully, she said, her voice low. I was wrong about you. About a lot of things. I'm sorry it took me so long to see that. Layla regarded her for a moment, then nodded graciously. Thank you, Mrs. Rutherford. I hope you enjoyed the performance. As Elizabeth walked away, Maria wrapped her arm around Layla's shoulders. You've come so far, Mija, she said, her voice thick with emotion. You've changed so many hearts, including your own. Layla leaned into her mother's embrace, her eyes shining. I couldn't have done it without you, Mama. Every time I dance, I carry a piece of home with me. As they left the theater, stepping out into the bright lights of New York City, Maria knew that this was just the beginning. Layla had broken through barriers and opened doors, not just for herself, but for all the young dancers who would follow in her graceful, determined footsteps. The journey hadn't been easy, but watching her daughter shine on stage, Maria knew it had all been worth it. If Layla's journey moved you, let us know in the comments below. We hope her story reminds you that even in the face of discrimination, talent, strength, and truth will always rise. Thank you for watching, and don't forget to subscribe for more uplifting stories like this one.